Good morning. I'm David Grech, and my family name is Tassiko. And why is it important that why am I starting this lecture with this? Here in Gozo, the first thing that someone asks you is, Maltese is, min ta' minint. Who are you from? And it was a very interesting question when everyone asked me. And when I went home and asked my father, he asked me, who are you from? And he's telling me he's back there in the Tassiko. That's my family's name, my family's nickname. However, my grandmother, she was from another family, from Shmundi. My mother was Maltese, she wasn't from Gozo, so their nicknames were a bit more clean. My grandfather was Naudi, so he was Tanaudi. My grandmother was Kalleya, so she was from Takalleya. When I got married, I ended up with further nicknames within our family, and my children now can say they are from the Lozo family and from the Garga family. And it gets a bit confusing. So, while I started in this hobby, my grandmother was a fountain of knowledge. She didn't do any research, she didn't do any work online, but whenever I went to her house and I told her, this is my friend from school, she would, in 3 ways or 4 dots, connect him to our family. Oh, so this is your school friend? Yes. His mother is this person. Her sister is married to this man who is my second cousin. And she could do this with everyone that I mentioned. It was fascinating. I wish that back then I had the knowledge and the experience to jot this down and connect how my grandmother could put everyone that I mentioned back connected to us. She passed, unfortunately, 6 years ago, and after that I said I want to record her knowledge now through something. I got lucky because about 5 years ago in the archives of Gozo there was a donation of a set of volumes called the Giuliana Mazzini, which were archival notary archives from a notary back in the 1800s. He was Gozo, and he went to all the parishes in Gozo and he recorded page by page their birth registers, their marriage registers, and their death registers. Someone in the archives scanned them online, and now, without having to go anywhere, in my home I could research and find connections. The first few generations were easy. You could go to my uncles, to my parents' uncles who are still alive, and they'll tell you and fill in some information. I remember one time where I was at hospital, my great-grandfather was in hospital, and I had just started going out with my girlfriend, my now wife. I was 16, 17 years old, and I hadn't even met her parents yet. I go in, and in the hospital room, I find Miriam's grandfather. He's visiting my great-grandfather in hospital. I said, okay, I haven't even gone to their house yet and they're visiting my relatives. He leaves and my grandmother who's there tells me, he is my cousin. What? No, it's my second cousin. And I said, okay, so these are my grandparents, these are Miriam's great-parents, and they're second cousins. So let me try and go a step up. My great-grandfather, who was visiting in hospital, is the first cousin of Giuseppe Cerri, il-lewża. That means that his mother, Maria Sherry, and Michela Sherry, and these are their marriage dates in 1908 and 1909, were siblings, which put this couple, Francesco Sherry and Caterina Bonnici, as the latest common ancestor of my wife and I. That puts my father and my mother-in-law as third cousins, which puts me and my wife as fourth. It may seem that it's quite close, but if you look at it from a blood percentage, that means that we are somewhere around here. Okay. What does it mean? It means that me and Miriam share about 0.2% of our genetic material. You yourself, you're at 100, and then you would go down to percentages which are irrelevant. Family doesn't grow in a single line. Most times, sometimes some websites offer the option to find your patrilineal line, your father's line. I wanted to do something different. A tree branches out, and I wanted to go up as much as possible. However, I soon started to realize that once you go up a level, your number doubles. So these are my children, these are me and my wife, these are our parents, our great-grandparents, and as you go up, you finally reach a number which is close to around 10,000 people, and that's up to 13 generations. These are 8,192 ancestors that both my children share. Which made me think, let me go and delve deeper into this and see where do we connect. So I really found the connection between me and my wife. Could I find a connection higher up? Could I find a connection between my mother and my father? Or between my father and my father-in-law? And easily enough, within the 10th or 11th generation, I managed to connect both our parents together. And that includes my mother's side, which is from Malta. Interestingly enough, and I'll come to this point later, I managed to connect our great-grandparents. Small, I won't go into detail, but one interesting fact that came out was that I could more easily connect my grandfather from Malta, who lived in Furiana, to my father here, to my grandfather here in Victoria, than I could connect my grandfather with Miriam's grandfather who lived in Shara, which was interesting because here in Gozo, up till 1855, we had 6 parishes. We had 7, there was in the 1530s, and before there were 4 parishes in Gozo, all here in Victoria. Matrice, which was the cathedral, St. George here, there was Savina, and St. Jacob, St. James Church. All these 4 divided Rabat between them and formed 4 parishes of Gozo. After 1551, unfortunately, after the Turks ransacked Gozo, 2 of these parishes ended up in disuse, and when someone from the Vatican came over in 1575, he stopped those parishes and left just two. Matrice and Rabat. You tell me, what about the rest of Gozo? Up till 1637, in Gozo there was a curfew. The curfew meant that anyone residing in Gozo needed to, at sundown, return back to the citadel and sleep at the citadel. This was because Gozo is an island with a lot of safe harbors on all sides of the island, and thus was very easily prone to attack. Lots of people, however, had fields outside of Rabat, which they needed to till, they needed to take care of. After the curfew was lifted, they started migrating to the first fields. And in 1678, the first parish was formed in Shawkia, 27th November 1678. I remember, not because I remember names, but it was the street I lived on as a kid. ARP was formed a year later, in 1679, and 9 years later, in 1688, Nadur, Shara, Sannat, and Zerbuj were also formed. If you look at if any one of you were to do a family tree, you would find out that once you hit a marriage within a village, it will be very difficult for you to get out of that village. During my research, I even talked to people firsthand who would tell you, we lived in Shara, and if our sisters were to have a boyfriend from Victoria, from Rabat, we would chase them away. Everything was contained within the village. This led to quite close families and led to situations where the same surnames would be found in certain villages. I even tried to match the people themselves. So, do we have any connections within our family tree which are the same? And yes, the answer is that very much so. We have a lot of marriages which would pop up along the family tree, sometimes at different generations. This particular fellow, John Maria Sultana, married Maria Mercia. Their marriage was in 1679. Shara wasn't even formed as a parish, so this marriage happened at Santa Maria's church at the Matrice. My grandmother, during all her family tree, matches one time with this particular fellow. Miriam's grandparents matched twice, while her grandfather finds this marriage 7 times in his family tree, and her grandmother, this person pops up 12 times along the same family tree. I went one step up and I searched for his parents. Giovanni Sultana and Margherita Mintov are the root of all the Sultanas here in Gozo. I could trace all the marriages happening in the 16 and 1700s back to this person, which meant that I managed to connect all 8 of my children's great-grandparents with this common ancestor of all 8 of us. One particular great-grandparent finds this individual 22 times within her own family tree. I'm sure that many of you will, when I mention certain villages, will spot out certain names, like Putiġieġ in Ala, Portelli in Nadur, Sultana in Xara, Mintof, Parnis in Muxar, and these close-knit families led to a lot of marriages where there was cosanguine. Cosanguine is the relation of blood. Up till a few years ago, getting up to the second or third state of blood required approval from the Vatican. Nowadays, it was expanded a bit more. Don't mind all the squares, but I wanted to find now the other way. If I mention a surname, can I trace it back? Can I find the Adam and Eve of this family? And in Gozo, we got lucky. Lucky why? Because in 1551, when the whole of Gozo was wiped off into slavery, a lot of families ended up either in slavery or dead. Most of the noble families, however, managed to pay the ransom and get back to Gozo. Why was it important? Because they had assets, they had the fields, and for them it was important to get back. And this led to situations where now in the mid-1500s we have a very small population here in Gozo of around 1,000 people. And most of them are now the root of each family. One particular family that I researched is the Raba family. Any Raba in the house? The Raba family was a well-known Muslim family in archives found in notarial documents in the 1400s. The Raba family were a nobile family, and they were a family whose main patriarchal member of the family would be a Capitan della Verga of Gozo, which would be like the mayor of Gozo. And you'd find the Raba, well, in 1551, a Raba priest was killed while he was protecting his church here in Gozo. A noble Raba was said to be, and there are notarial archives on this, was ransomed over from Turkey, where she wrote part of her will, which are still found in Palermo and in Malta. Branches die off. So the Raba family, Giulio Raba in 1669 had Andrea, who had Luca, and Luca had Rosa Raba, who married 3 times. How would I know that she married 3 times? On the church record, when someone was a widow or a widower, it would be written down in the notarial records. Through this line, although the Raba family was lost because Rosario married Benigno Gallia, I could trace the Gallia who married the side who ended up with a Thelma, and the Thelma is the great-grandfather of my wife. The Raba still here nowadays. We have a lot of Muslims. If you go to Malta, however, you'll find very few Rabas. You'll find a few, and through this, we find that sometimes our surname shifts, adapts itself to its circumstances. The Ropa family, where there is a bust of Morel Ropa in Villarandin, can trace its family back to Raba. In Ormi, in Malta, we find the Arapa family, where one particular rabba from Gozo moved over to army, back then called Casal Pinto. Over the space of 2 generations, some of his children married and registered themselves as rabba, while some others, siblings, registered their marriage as Araba. By the next generation, all the army rabbas are now Arabas. It's a family that still today you can find mostly in the army area. Where do I find this information? Nowadays, we're lucky with the internet and with our technology that not only are these records of notarial archives found scanned online, where I can go page by page, but a lot of volunteers are going through these pages and documenting these into a database. It's a database which is free, which any one of you can use, and it's a database which, once I search with the surname and who the husband's father and mother is, I can find all the rabba belonging to this particular couple. Andrea Rabba and Katrina Tar had 3 sons, one of whom married twice. First to Giuseppe Rabba and then to Maria Tar. There are a lot of other sources of information. St. George have just recently launched a database of their birth, marriages and death records. You pay a nominal fee to have credits and you can search within the database. The Gozo Korea archives have scanned on their website archives from the Santa Maria Parish, archives from Shara up till 1986, archives from Shokia, and all of these build and complete our picture. There's the government side of things. Since 1863, the government has been keeping record of all the births, all the marriages, and all the deaths. In Maltese, called the insinua. And from there you can get and request certificates of births, marriages, and deaths. It doesn't mean that there aren't any mistakes. My uncle in Malta, when he heard I was doing this research, he told me he had at his home an original birth certificate for my great-grandfather. They had requested it when he had passed, and they needed it for that, to sort out the will. It was an original certificate with the stamp of the British government, stamped and signed by a public official. So this is an official document. However, going through it, trying to go one step back and finding who his parents were, I wasn't able to find this marriage. Giuseppe Calleja, his father Carmelo, who married, and his mother Rosa Zara. Looking and looking, going over to different parishes in Malta, in Nashar, in Valletta, I was unable to find a marriage between a Carmelo Calleja and a Rosa Zara. Just to have a complete set, I ordered the same certificate myself online, just to have it in the same format. And when I received this same certificate from the same institution, it turns out that Rosa wasn't Zara, Rosa was Pasha. So my official document mentioned that his mother is a Rosa Zara, someone who was copying it by hand back then did a mistake. When I found that marriage, and I found it immediately, I realized that her mother was Zara. So who copied the birth certificate mistook one's surname for the other and wrote it down. A couple of weeks ago, I was talking to the Bishop of Gozo. We were on the ferry and we were talking about this particular talk. And he tells me that every month he has 3 or 4 requests to officially sign off a change or a mistake in a parish register. So within the register, someone's name would be written a certain way, sometimes it's totally different. During this, we even found a number of inconsistencies between surnames. My wife's surname before marriage was Tauma. Sometimes we find Tauma with a TH, sometimes we find Tauma with a TE. Her 4 siblings all write Tauma in a different way. One has a THEU, MA, one has a TEU, someone has a THEW, MA. And these small mistakes, generation over generation, sometimes open up to a lot of different new aspects, like Sammut and Zammit. A lot of times you'd have a birth record of a person and it's written as Zammit, and then the marriage certificate of that same person is now a Sammut. This creates a number of issues. However, I want to go even further. I said, within my 3, what was the most common surname I found? And surprisingly enough, the first 5 surnames that I found were not my surname, not my wife's surname, not my parents' surname, not even my grandparents' surname. So up till the 4th generation of people within my family, although these 5 surnames were the most common in all the 3, they were further off. If you go to NSO statistics, you'd find that these 5 are around Malta one of the most common surnames. Grech was the 8th, Sherry 7th, Thomas 16th. Now there wasn't such a common surname, Dantlan the 7th, and so on with Sultana, Portelli, and Calleja. A lot of these surnames, you'd find out that there is a very heavy influence on Gozo. How do I know that? Up till a few years ago, the electoral registry was, you could buy it from the local council in a digital form. And I managed to extract some data on the surnames, and you would have where some surnames go. Kassar, Biġeni, Cremona, Refolo, and the Rapa I mentioned before are all surnames where in Gozo you'd find a greater concentration. Doesn't mean that there aren't any Kassars in Malta. Kassar is a very popular surname, it's the 9th. Biġeni, today in Gozo, there isn't a lot of Biġenis, but the moment you start going into the 1800s, you'd find a number of Biġenis across all of our family trees. The reality is that if I could pick any one of you within 7, 8 generations, would be able to match with anyone. how deep their connections go? Is it just coincidence that me and my wife matched at the 7th generation? Can we do it with historical figures? Can we do it with bishops, politicians, or members of Gozo? And I did just that. After finding what I could find within our family tree, I started delving into the family trees of others. And I said, let me find French Il-Hagar. His family, his parents can be easily found. And I went up 4 generations from him. And I did manage to find a connection. Carmi Grima, Nino Cremona, Vittor Vella was the master mason who built Tapino. Lawrence Gonzi. With all of these, I managed to find a connection to my family tree. And I am sure that the connection would be the same to each and every one of you. We had 9 bishops in Gozo. Bishop Dauma is the 9th bishop in Gozo. And I did an exercise on all 9 bishops. Some, I found a connection within 2 generations. So we share the grandparent of that bishop is a common ancestor to my tree. Surprisingly enough, the one took me longest to find a connection for was Bishop Grech. Although we share the same surname, because of the villages aspect of Gozo, and Bishop Grech was a Kirchen and the Ala Grech, it did not intermix with the Grech family of Victoria. Nowadays, it is a little bit more different. Nowadays, who is a relative? What is blood? And with today's globalization, where a lot may be married outside of their country, it happened before. Naudi, my ancestor from my mother's side, was a Frenchman, born in France. If he was a knight or not, that's something that, but probably he was a merchant coming over from France because Gozo, Malta at the time, was an economic hub. He lived in Senglia, and all the Naudis that today exist in Malta can trace back to this one individual. I made the Naudi family tree, and today there are 3 branches left. About 6 years ago, my grandmother from Malta passed away, and I was taking care of the funeral details. And she wanted to be buried next to her husband, the Naudi, in Adolorata Cemetery. I asked my uncle for the plot number. Went there, and the plot belonged to a notary Naudi. The plot is divided into 3. Our family owns the A. B and C were of some other branch of Naudi. However, when I was doing this research, I realized that the C, I met them somewhere along my family line. It turns out that my great-grandmother was a Kutayar, married an Naudi, and her friend, who was an Naudi, the sister, married the Kutayar, her brother. So both families joined back up together. And these connections, you wouldn't even realize. I was at the conference in Malta, at the Mediterranean conference, about 800 people, and I sit down next to an individual. It was me and my father, and you exchange pleasantries. Hi, my name is David. His surname was Portanier, which isn't a common surname in Malta. However, it rang a bell that this person could be related. I said, if I don't ask, I will end up. And I asked him, is your mother named Teresina? And he was like, yes, how do you know that? And trying to explain to him that me and him are third cousins wasn't easy at the between conference. However, we became friends on Facebook. He introduced me to his mother, who I talked to over the phone, and she helped flesh out some more of the family line. A couple of months passed, and I met Dwayra camping with the Scouts. We had invited the Slima group to come and camp with us. After camp, this individual sent me a message. My daughter really enjoyed herself at camp with you guys. So one of these Scouts in Slima was a leader with me. She was there at camp with her 4 cousins, who are my children. In the 1940s, 50s, 60s, and even beyond, there was a lot of emigration here from Malta. So unfortunately, some lines get lost in the distance. I asked, for example, my grandmother's brothers. My grandmother were 14 siblings. 3 of them died young. Of the other 11, at one point in the 1980s, only 2 of them were still living in Gozo. All the others were living in Canada, America, Australia. Some are still there today. So, the further out you go, sometimes it's a bit more difficult to link that connection. Although, sometimes they do appreciate their Maltese roots. A second cousin of my mother, her grandmother emigrated to Libya in the early 1900s. Back then, there is a number of books who detail the diaspora of Maltese and Cositans in Algiers, in Libya and Tripoli. I managed to find her on Facebook. She sent me photos, certificates, and all that she had retained from her grandmother who had lived in Malta years and years ago. Today we have different kinds of families. We have blended families. We have siblings who may not be blood. My great-grandmother, she had married in Tucini, Talmia, who had passed after having 1 child, and married again to my great-grandfather, Tassico, who were they named the horses after Il-Hooves. Today, even though they married over 100 years ago, my grandfather passed, all his siblings have passed away, and now even some of the second generation are starting to pass. But these half cousins, half siblings, half second cousins, we still have that connection. And is family at the end just blood? So I'll ask again, in a minute. But when I was young, my answer was very simple. I am from the Siko clan. Nowadays, my answer would be totally different and would take a long time to answer. When the person who answered me would be sorry to have asked it. In total, there were 4,095 marriages, which made up my family tree up to the 13th generation. Of these, I managed to find 3,476 dated. So I know the day of this marriage and the place where this marriage occurred. Another 234, I know what their names are, especially the father and his surname and what the mother's name is, but unfortunately I was unable to trace this particular marriage. Over here we're talking mostly about 1600s, okay? Up till the 1800s I managed to find all the marriages. 385 marriages, I could not identify who the parents were. Why? Some of them were orphans. You'd find in the church records that the father was an alumni, was an orphan, so his family tree, unfortunately, will never be able to be completed. Others were padre ignoto. Padre ignoto is father unknown, and this wasn't a recent phenomena. It's a phenomena which you'd find a number of times within church records. Usually, what you will find is that the mother's father would then be listed in the birth register, so that they have a male listed. Unfortunately, within the 9th generation, through one of my lines, I stumbled upon the situation. So him, his parents, his great parents, and so on, up to the 13th generation, I have a whole batch within my tree which I didn't find. There are also some lost records. So the Giuliana Mazzini, which I mentioned before, is a stack of around 63 volumes. However, the notary was very meticulous, A's, B's, C's. The G volume is missing. So, although some of that information is found in some of the other books, because he not only wrote G's by order, he also wrote parish by order, or births by order. However, some records I couldn't find. In Shara, in the 1800s, 1814, the plague arrived in Shara. Where a merchant from Gozo bought a faldetta, a piece of woman's clothing, from a victim, from someone who was infected, and gave it to his daughter. In fact, the concentration of deaths occurred in Shara, and especially close to the chapel of Saint Anthony the Abbot. The first 3 people laid to rest were, in fact, this man, his daughter, and the sexton, Coronato Rama, which we have already seen in one of our, so we have a direct connection with that plague. Unfortunately, one of the church records and one of the books of the church had to be burned because it got infected. And back then no one was in mind to copy it. So we have a section of marriages occurring in the late 1700s where we cannot ascertain certain dates. I see Jenny here because we talked about the situation. We had 3 siblings, Giacomo, for the other 2. Their parents were Paolo Scerri and Maria Healy. There is very clear evidence that these people were named Paolo Scerri and Maria Healy. However, through the marriage record, we could not find this particular marriage in the late 1700s. We managed to trace them back through an animarus register, which was the register that the parish priest would do to see who lives in my city. And they were listing every house and every street. Can we trace even further back? Some websites will give you lines tracing back a lot. However, in official terms, the first record held here in Gozo is a marriage happening in around 1559. Before that, some look into noble family lines. Why? Because noble families kept their own family tree for one particular reason: money. So we said we're not going to talk about money, but we'll talk a bit about money. Why? Because noble families owned land, and they needed to make sure that once they pass, this land goes to who is part of this family. If we look at the Tapino story, last year another book was issued, you'd find the story of Tapino from even before the knights were here, how it was destined to be abandoned, how somehow managed to survive, and when the church authorities went to buy the land from the noble family which now owned it, you could trace that family's line all the way back through the different noble families of Gozo. So what data can I trust? As we said, even government data sometimes puts a mistake. Even the church records do a mistake. So most of the times you would manage to corroborate the same data across different aspects to confirm it. On some websites, you'll even find how some surnames come back from the emirs of Malta. How some Kalleja, Camilleri, Zara, and these surnames, which are Arabic in origin, trace back to some of the noble line who were in charge of Malta up till 1240. It was when Count Roger came to Malta and then came, plant his flag and kick everyone out. He told them, and it comes back to money, he told them, now you pay taxes to me and not to the Caliphate in Tunis. They told him, what can we say? And the same people who were in charge of Malta back then remained, and there's evidence to show that they remained in charge for another 150 years. So if I could trace my line to that, can I trace it to La Valette? In my family I found in 4 instances where I am in the 16th century and I find a Valletta or La Valletta. So does it mean that it could go likely there? There's a jump of more. We know that La Valette, later on in his life, he did acknowledge a child in France. So, I don't know, maybe I am from La Valette as well. Through my lines in the Camilleri, in the Zara, in the others. These emirs of Malta, once you reach a certain level, these are Wikipedia people, so people whose lines are very well documented through history. And we know that the Caliphate of the Caliphate had a very strong position, not just in central the Mediterranean, but also in Cordoba, in Spain. The Emir of Cordoba, his great-grandfather, was a common ancestor of none other than Muhammad the Prophet. And in the Quran, like there is in the Bible, there is the line of Muhammad, going back from Muhammad all the way up to Abraham. In the Bible, we have two family trees. In the New Testament, we have one in Luke, one in Matthew. They're not the same, so there's already a red flag there, which traces back one from Abraham down to Jesus, through Mary, and one through Joseph on the other line. The one in Luke goes a step further up and goes from Abraham all the way up to Adam. So technically, can I trace my line all the way there? No, it's a bit more. This research is never done. Every month, volunteers in Malta are scanning a new Juliana. A Juliana is a collection of documents. In Malta there was the Juliana Adami, now we have the Juliana Mazzini, and now there's the Juliana Leonard. And the group of volunteers are every week going through page by page and translating that into a database. Every month they release an update. They tell us, this month we worked on Luqa Parish 1700 to 1800. And I go through my tree, see where I have some missing information, and more often than not, I find the next step. And then it opens up more possibilities. The St. George Register, which was issued just a few weeks ago, will also help fill in some gaps. I did try to sometime go to St. George Parish, but after the third, fourth time, the priest was a little bit more upset with me. No need to mention who the priest was. The more this information becomes public, the more each and every one of us can find this more easy, especially up till when we have government information, and we would realize how much we are related. It doesn't mean that I'm from Malta, I am from Gozo. Sometimes, even when I talk with foreigners, there's a number of pages on Facebook where people whose great-grandfather was Maltese, and they would be trying to find their roots. And immediately, you would find a connection. So, we're all connected, some way or another. And especially in a small place like Gozo, it's even more. So, sometimes we divide ourselves by parishes, by our saints, by our football clubs, by our political colors, where at the end of the day, we're all just one big family. Any questions?
And the thing that you said that we are all interconnected. You mentioned you had 3,000 marriages in your. If you can dramatize this book, which is a transcription of the first parish in Gozo, that would prove my theory that we are all related to each other in Gozo.
Those 3,000 marriages, some of them are duplicate marriages. So as I said, the Giovanni Sultana, I found him in my family tree over 4 times. The same marriage, sometimes in the 10th generation, sometimes in the 11th, sometimes in the 15th.
No, what I'm saying is, if you go back 11 generations, you go to 1600.
Something like that.
So there would be about 1,000 people. There would be about 1,000 people.
In fact, the earliest from the Grech line, for example, the earliest I could go was around 1580, where I found the marriage. Back then it was in the Matrice, and it didn't list who his parents were. So this was the last line. probably the marriage before occurred before 1551, so those records are probably lost. Yes?
Are there any IT programs that you use to make all these correlations? It's a lot of work, you know?
I used Excel. There are a number of programs online. However, I love Excel because Excel lets me extract data and do statistical analysis on them. So, for example, I could find a number of surnames. In all my family tree, I ended up with 176 different surnames. Sometimes the surname only occurs once. These exotic surnames, sometimes you branch out abroad. Excel is good, but after I started doing the family tree, I realized that Excel has a limit on the number of columns. It's like XLV column, and I had to split up my Excel into 8 to fit what my family tree wanted. I started doing an online program on one of these family tree websites, and it helps find connections immediately. But more often than not, I also find a number of mistakes. Why? Because some people take assumptions. Sometimes, in some cases, I also had to take some assumptions, which were calculated. Why? In Gozo, it's easy because you'd find only one marriage which fits the criteria between a John and a Mary, Camilleri and Borch. In Malta, however, you'd find multiple couples who got married within the space of a few years, John Camilleri and Mary Borch. So then I would have to stop. But in Gozo, you would find 3 marriages, but one which occurred 20 years prior to the marriage you're looking up from, and the other was 120 years before, so definitely it wasn't this. So some assumptions did have, but whenever I was in doubt, I stopped. I didn't go up and assume that this is this marriage and it is this marriage, because I wanted to be as accurate as possible and as real as possible. If I wanted to, in Malta, I would find the first John and Mary Borch and just trace it up, but I would have a more complete tree, but it won't be true. Yes?
Yes, I did a similar family tree for my family, Sherby and Wojcik from Hala, and I found very helpful the records, the archives in Palermo. Archives in Palermo filled a gap of about 6 generations. From the last generation in Gozo, some would be in Malta, but also in Palermo. From there, I went even further, way back.
Mostly you'd probably find the well-off families.
Yes.
Because the common farmer would have no need to trace back his family line because he owned nothing and will give out nothing after he dies.
With respect to Libya, you mentioned the 1551 siege. First of all, some families did survive. One of them is on my father's side, who remained here. The others are mainly in Tarragona, in Libya. There's very few in Turkey. About 8,000 still live in Tarragona and Libya today, which Professor Whittinger found before he died way back in 2007. A lot of them have surnames which are Gozo related, but also adapted to their Libyan, the Arab language, Libyan version of our surname. So they are there, residents from 500 years ago, living in this village, and they carry as well a lot of our traditions. I just wanted to see if you're interested in going abroad, because I am a diaspora person who have a lot of family trees outside, positive family trees in the US, Canada.
In fact, I think that from what I could find here in Gozo and in Malta, I'm reaching a number of blocks now, because either they went abroad, either they came from abroad. I even tried to search the Naudi line in France, but once I went there, I realized that Naudi there is a very popular surname. So it was very difficult to navigate through. I think something that, and this is something that I was talking to even church authorities and even government, was to make this information more accessible, especially information which now is over 100 and maybe 50 years old, because of GDPR, recent data. I maybe understand that it's kept a bit more private, but releasing information about these things would make it more easy for everyone to trace back the roots.